Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman had a very straightforward opinion on trade.
The economics profession has been almost unanimous on the subject of the desirability of free trade. In every country, it always is and must be in the interest of the great body of the people to buy whatever they want of those who sell it cheapest.
But that straightforward policy is not what we see in international trade policy today.
President Biden announcing new tariffs on $18 billion worth of Chinese imports.
President Trump has called for large tariff increases across the board on China.
Are trade restrictions effective?
We are in a trade war. We've been in one for 20 years with China.
We have to go after the Chinese corporations.
Well, I know it doesn't happen overnight, but how long is it going to take to actually lessen the dependence on China?
If Americans can broadly agree on nothing else, we should be able to agree that much of the bitterness and political tribalism that drives our public discussions is unhealthy for our country. In order to debate contentious public policy issues in a respectful and engaging manner without abandoning deeply held principles, the Cato Institute, in collaboration with the Brookings Institution, presents Sphere. International trade policies lie on a continuum. On the one end, you have unfettered free trade. Buy and sell whatever you want with whomever you want across international borders. At the other extreme lies autarky or self-sufficiency, where everything you want to consume is produced within the borders of your own country. Within those two extremes lie variations of managed trade, where the government intervenes to manipulate where goods and services are produced and consumed. Perhaps an attempt to keep trade balanced or to protect domestic jobs from foreign competition. Conversations around international trade policy today are often concerned with how the goods and services in question might affect our security. Do we need to be careful about what we are willing to trade with countries that might pose a security risk, countries such as China? Joining me now to discuss these and other issues are Scott Lincicome, Vice President of General Economics and the Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, Josh Meltzer, Senior Fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution, and Arthur Herman, Senior Fellow and Director of the Quantum Alliance at the Husdson Institute. Welcome to Sphere.
Thank you.
Scott, let's start with you. On this panel, you are perhaps the most comfortable with completely unfettered free trade. Why is that your position? And doesn't complete openness leave us vulnerable to when markets freeze up in times of conflict or a global pandemic, just to pick an example entirely at random? Yes.
Well, there are several reasons that I think it is important that we have a general rule of free trade with limited exceptions, very limited exceptions. I think the first reason, the most fundamental reason, is that trade is not among nations. It is not about trade deficits, or it is not about geostrategic competition. It is about people. It is about two people in two different places seeking to improve their lives and engage in mutually beneficial commerce. They want to do this to improve themselves. And so the vast majority of trade is humans doing the things they've done for millennia, before borders even existed. But technology today has made it so much easier, whether it's because of containerized shipping or digital trade and the internet and the rest. So when we start from that, we then, I hopefully can understand a bit more that there is very little difference, particularly economically, between trading with someone next door or someone in South Carolina if you live in North Carolina where I live, or someone in a different country. All of those transactions are free people doing things to better themselves, and that the government getting involved in that is a restriction on that activity and on that economic liberty. But there are, I think, also more pragmatic reasons. The fact is that there are volumes of economics literature that show that trade generates pretty substantial benefits. We not only get lower prices and more variety. I grew up in the 1980s, back when seasonal produce was still a thing. Now you can just go to the grocery store and you can get anything you want at any time. And that's not even thinking about things like Amazon. But you have more than that as well. It produces economic growth and dynamism and innovation. It's that churn in an economy that we want. It's part of that special sauce that improves living standards beyond just getting cool produce at the grocery store. And then the other big reason is that we also have volumes of literature on the alternative to free trade: protectionism, tariffs, quotas, and other government restrictions on that free exchange that I discussed. And the fact is they just don't work very well. Not only do they raise prices, not only do they generate all sorts of unintended consequences, but they actually don't really do a good job protecting industry and protecting jobs. In case after case after case, protected companies, protected jobs end up disappearing anyway, or they stick around, they become kind of zombie industries that aren't innovative because, of course, they're protected from competition, and competition pushes companies to get ahead. When you are protected by all those tariffs and things, you don't do that.
So, Arthur, you call yourself an advocate of trade, but also caution that trade can have negative consequences, particularly negative cultural consequences. So I guess what you would say is trading across borders isn't actually like trading with somebody next door. What sort of negative cultural consequences do you see trade having?
Well, I could frame it this way. If the question comes up about trade, do restrictions on trade affect national security and vice versa? I would say that my own view would be that trade should be a function of national interests, while recognizing that free trade should be an imperative of a free and open society. Individuals should be able to find the best price, be able to find the best product, to be able to negotiate in order to acquire the things that they need and want. And I think historically we have to say that the principle of free trade tends to capture that quality of it. It's the grounding for prosperity. Of being able to find the goods that you want, to buy from those who offer those goods at the best possible price and at the best possible quality. And I have to agree with Scott. I think we can say that, generally speaking, economic transactions of any kind are between people, and that's true. But we also have to recognize the fact that people tend to belong to nations. Or to communities, much as they may not want to do that and want to be free individuals. The fact is that they are also constrained by the rules that their nation, that their country, their community imposes upon them. So then that throws the issue about what constitutes free trade for a society that recognizes the value of it, the importance of it. How does that put you in relation to those who don't recognize that? And I guess the analogy that comes to mind is, again, trade is between people, right? So is a card game, right? So let's think about this if you were participants in a weekly poker game, right? With 5 players. And you all get together and play, and everybody knows the rules of poker that you're playing. But then it turns out one of your players cheats. And your first reaction is, you shouldn't cheat. Maybe you don't understand the rules, so you go and you buy them a nice set of rules. You provide them with new rules, and see this is how we're supposed to be playing this game. And everybody else agrees, yes, it's important to play the rule. And yet, a few hands go by, and then it turns out they're still cheating. They're still doing this. And you sort of say, well, they're cheating, but is it really that important? Because, he always brings the snacks and the drinks, right? We don't have to pay for that. I mean, that's an important part of it, right? Here. So we can overlook some of the money you lose because they're regarding the cheating. But then it begins to turn out, number one, that you're playing for higher and higher stakes. And it's not just for table stakes or for nickels and dimes or $20 or $50. It's for your car. It's for your house. It's for your children's college fund. And he's still cheating. Then what do? Well, I think one of the things first is you're not going to play with him anymore. Right? That's one option that you get to engage in. The other players say, well, we're going to continue because he's not after our car and he's not after my kid's college fund and all that. You say, well, watch out, because even though I'm out. So then you begin to sort of say, maybe it's time for us to supply our own drinks and snacks. And now you've come into the issue about to what degree we come to the issue of reshoring. Of outsourcing versus reshoring. This is my sneaky way of getting into that issue. Because the country that we're talking about when we're now today, where the issue of the value of free trade versus national security concerns really focuses ultimately on one country, and that's China. I mean, there's always concern about, and there has about Japan and about Korea, but there are players at the card game who recognize the rules. They want to win, but they also recognize that it's important to play by the rules. They don't cheat. They don't, for example, they don't bring their own deck, which is marked. And that's when you begin to worry about how this game is going to be played here. And I think when we come to the question, I want to talk later about, if we can, about globalization in the context of all this. But if we think about the role of trade and weighing it against national interests, I think it's important for us to think about it not just in broad general terms, or even in the terms that I just presented of a card game, right, a poker game, but to think in concrete of the relationship between our economy and China's and the way in which how China sees the role of trade and economic relationships in the way that we do. And that relationship, I think, is one that has forced us and should force us not to rethink the principle of free trade, but to understand the ways in which it applies and does not apply to certain kinds of economic exchanges, certain kinds of commodities, particularly those which are essential and important for our national security.
I'm glad you raised that, because I wanted to touch on something that I know Josh has written about before. Josh, you've said China is a critical supplier in areas where the United States wants to be more competitive and thus could be seen to have leverage over the United States, similar to what Arthur was just talking about. But you've said we should also keep in mind that the United States has leverage over China as well. What do you mean by that, and why is it so important?
Right. So I don't want to stretch the analogy of the card game too far, but the situation of how do we think about, I think, trade policy in the context of a player like China, which is such a large and important economy, I think is really the crucial question for sort of trade and economic policy today. And it challenges, I think, a lot of our kind of notions about how do we think about the benefits from free trade, how do we manage those benefits in an environment where you have a very significant actor that is either not playing by the same rules but has a very different conception about the role of trade for their economy, how economies grow, and so forth. I'm going to answer the question, but I do want to kind of underscore, like, one of the key sort of, I guess, theories that have always underpinned why we trade is this notion of comparative advantage. And, there's very simplistic models about, you produce wine or you produce cloth, and it's better off to specialize in one if you can and buy the other. But the bottom line of the comparative advantage analysis is the following. It is that you don't export for the sake of exporting, you export in order to earn money to import. If you think about a business, right? I'm always a little wary about stretching the business analogy with how countries think about trade, but when you make sales, like you are not making sales for the sake of making sales, like you sell stuff to earn money to buy stuff, right? Like at the end of the day, you sell things to actually generate an income so you can actually go and consume and buy and purchase and so forth. And it's not dissimilar when thinking about that from the perspective of international trade. Like exports are not the end in of themselves. Exports are very much about essentially the capacity to then import to buy what we don't make domestically. And underlying that is this notion of an exchange of goods, right? You have to kind of believe that you are both made better off by an exchange of goods. And the Chinese economy is not really set up to play by that rule. So it's not even a matter so much of, a decision that could or could not be undone. Like the underlying structure of the Chinese economy is geared towards heavily overinvested in capacity. They essentially produce a lot of products. They don't have the domestic capacity to consume it, and so they rely heavily on exports. And so you end up with these like perpetual, essentially, and growing trade surpluses. They essentially export what they produce to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world essentially decided, the United States, increasingly Europe, have decided they're not willing to essentially tolerate that arrangement anymore. It's not economically sustainable, it's not politically sustainable, and now it's sort of got a national security element as well because of the sort of underlying mistrust and competition with China in a lot of these sort of high-tech products that they are now exporting. There's a view that we are not going to sort of tolerate deeper integration with you around a whole range of products. So this gets into the leverage point, which is essentially the US has been running a deep trade deficit with China forever, essentially, and it keeps getting larger. So it's in the order of $400 odd billion. And the leverage piece simply comes from the fact that we import a whole lot more than we export to China, and it's also the nature of the import. So the theory around economic interdependence that was sort of prevalent following World War II was that as countries traded more with each other, they would become more economically integrated, they would not go to war with each other, that these kind of economic ties would dampen essentially opportunities for conflict because there'd be too much at stake. And that's certainly what essentially drove the formation of the European Union after World War II, and it's sort of been the view that we have always had with respect to international trade broadly, that it's kind of a pacifying force over time. But it's also possible, and this is what we're seeing with China, that if you have an economic structure that is deeply at odds with the kind of way you would think that two countries can gain from trade, and then you layer on different political and other value disagreements, that economic interdependence can become a source of risk. And leverage, possibly. So you've seen China use its economic leverage, its market, and its the reliance of other countries on goods from them to try to achieve other political goals. And so that's a source of vulnerability. But the US has got some leverage over China because we import so much more from China. So China is more dependent, in a sense, on the US market. The other component to it is that because technology has become so central to the conflict between the US and China, who can build the next generation of artificial intelligence requires access to cutting-edge chips, and not only the actual chips, but the IP and the software and so forth that goes into making them, and a lot of that is very US-centric. So we can, sort of by restricting access to critical goods that China needs to really advance its economies, have leverage over China as well.
And just to clarify, IP is intellectual property. Scott, I saw you furiously writing notes. I'm sure you've got things to say. I do want to say, though, that both Arthur and Josh seem to be presenting the idea that that there are, I guess, issues around China's participation on the world stage or the structural things in its economy which suggests that the general rules you're talking about no longer apply or apply in a different way. Do we at least have to be, should we be worried about trading with countries like China, at least, especially when it comes to sensitive technology or defense materiel?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, and when we started this, I said, the general rule of free trade with legitimate exceptions, and the big exception is national security. Even free traders like Milton Friedman, Adam Smith have acknowledged there are legitimate national security reasons to limit trade in certain instances. We don't want to be buying our tanks and planes from China, for example. The big question, though, is, have we let that exception swallow the rule with respect to China? Is everything now a national security threat? Are solar panels from China really a national security threat? Well, President Biden seemed to think so the other day. That is the problem. And that is why you still have to be very skeptical when national security is invoked, if not more skeptical. A certain senator from Florida has called sugar a national security issue before. Chinese garlic has been called a national security issue recently. And this, I think, the reality is that once you open the door to these types of exceptions, then everybody starts saying, well, my industry is essential to national security. I need this type of protection or these subsidies and the rest. And so, yeah, while there are legitimate reasons to make exceptions, we do have to continue to keep them very narrow. And we, not only because we don't like the rent-seeking and the cronyism, that is bad, but it's also because we have to acknowledge that this does damage to the United States economy and to individual companies. When you put tariffs on steel for national security reasons, it hurts manufacturers that need steel, including automakers and others that we've just recently said are critical to national security as well. So we have to be really careful about letting that exception swallow the rule, and I think it really has with respect to China. And let me just add one more thing. The other big thing we have to ask is trade really a sporting event? Is it a game? I think that the analogy really fails in a lot of ways because games are zero-sum. There's a winner, there's a loser. Trade is positive sum. There can be two winners. People can change teams in the middle of trade. They don't do that in a basketball match or a poker game. Cheating is often, in the trade game, defined by national governments that have less than savory reasonings for defining stuff as cheating that isn't really cheating at all. It's just normal behavior. We call that dumping, is one of the classic examples of this. So you have to be really, really careful of saying, oh, it's just like sports. Team America, Team China, we're going to do this, they're going to do that. It really doesn't work very well in a lot of instances, outside of, again, those kind of discrete national security exceptions.
So, Arthur, I'm guessing your definition of when we should use trade restrictions is probably broader than Scott's. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it probably doesn't extend to sugar. But now when we come to an issue like TikTok, there I think we get into a little bit more, I'll call it a gray area. And my views on TikTok, by the way, have changed somewhat, I must tell you. When 3-4 years ago, I was a passionate advocate for banning TikTok because I saw it as a national security threat. And I saw it not just because of the issue of the handling of data by a Chinese company, TikTok and its mother company, ByteDance, but also because it is the algorithm that powers it is immensely addictive. And then when the government finally got around to actually doing something about TikTok, and I said, this is a mistake. I said, first of all, it was way too late. It was coming when TikTok was already embedded in the culture in ways it wasn't when I first got started with this. And then second of all, I thought in many ways we were missing the real story, which was how is it that a group of Chinese engineers were able to come up with a social media platform that was so addictive to Americans? How did they figure this out? What are they doing right that we're doing wrong? And I think that's one of the key issues that gets lost here when we try to come to ways to deal with the imbalances and the asymmetries that have developed between the U.S. and China in trade. And I would go so far as to say this, that in terms of the problems and issues that are posed by China to our national security in terms of our economic relationship with China, that I would say overall the government is the last institution that should be addressing those, because the government solutions almost invariably are wrong. And the solutions instead do lie in ways in which we can promote a private sector which is more technologically innovative, which is able to move ahead in terms of technological progress and in new directions here. And the way in which you are able to channel that private sector energy and innovation so it's directed towards national ends and ways in which can help us to deal with the very obvious and growing antagonism between the United States and China is the way to go. In other words, that we have major problems here, and it's very difficult to find many examples in which the government's intervention is going to be helpful.
It's interesting you raised that. We actually had a technology panel on AI and TikTok
example.
and things, and so we have to have you back for another panel on that, because TikTok is obviously a huge issue. It's under active litigation, very complex. So that I think will have to be a separate panel, because there's so many issues to get into there that you raise. But Josh, I just want to end with you and get back a little bit to the idea of the trade deficit. You have cautioned against using tariffs to reduce trade deficits. What, if any, value do you see in tariffs? I mean, do you see them as a revenue-raising device, just to take a timely example?
Yeah, so I think that during the Trump administration, there was, I think, for the first time in a very long time in U.S. trade policy, like this notion that if you looked at bilateral trade deficits, this was this sense of winning and losing, and so
like a scorecard, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and tariffs sort of as a way to kind of resolve that, and we've the kind of my discussion a bit before about the shape of the Chinese economy was also a little bit of a segue, I think, into this understanding this notion that the shape, the ultimate outcomes that countries are having in terms of trade policy is actually being driven by underlying economic factors, which are not going to be resolved and cannot be resolved by tariffs. That levels of investment, levels of savings are particularly important, to name a few. So the US has high levels of consumption, a very open capital account, so money can come in and out of the United States very quickly. You cannot do that with China. And you have essentially a very developed financial sector that pulls in a lot of capital. It has an effect on the exchange rate, and it leads to long-term trade deficits. And this is not necessarily with every country. The US has trade surpluses with some countries, trade deficits with others, but the net result is a trade deficit. And we've had now we've had an experiment of 5 or 6 years on tariffs on goods with China. We have seen some declines in trade in some of those areas where there are tariffs, but the overall bilateral trade deficit has essentially continued to grow. So tariffs are not a great tool to be kind of thinking about trying to address bilateral trade deficits, and arguably you really want to be thinking about sort of the other economic policy drivers that are at play rather than tariffs. I will say that, having said all that, there is a question today around what is the role of tariffs when it comes to China. And we saw recently that the Biden administration, there's been tariffs that Trump put in place. The Biden administration kept them. They've now recently put tariffs up on an additional sort of $18 billion worth of trade, which is actually small. It was a very sort of targeted increase in tariffs around things like electric vehicles and batteries and solar panels. And some of the tariffs are so high, we don't actually have that much trade in those goods anyway, so there's a 100% tariff on EVs. But it's really a message the United States is sending that we are not interested in a future where we're going to have more trade in those products with you. And it's the bigger question, I think, for the United States and other countries, because the EU has also now moved ahead to put what they call anti-dumping countervailing duties, but essentially tariffs on also imports from China, is that we are, to my earlier point, we're not prepared for deeper economic integration. We're not going to tolerate essentially importing all these subsidized goods from you anymore. It's not sustainable economically and politically. And, it's worth thinking about this because, EVs, solar, and others. These are industries where, for green transition reasons or for jobs reasons, governments have decided that they want to support essentially their transition to EVs, or they want to support their transition to clean energy. So there's a lot of investment going into these sectors, and so I think governments are legitimately then saying we don't want that to be wiped out by competition with China, which is also heavily subsidising their products. So I think this is where the tariff piece comes in.
Okay, so unfortunately we're running out of time, but I do want to follow up with one lightning round of questions for you all, so try to keep it very brief. What is one trade policy that the United States should adopt that would make us more secure? I'm going to go this way. Josh, I'll start with you.
So I think we one of the things that has really been degraded very significantly over the last 5 or 6 years has been the multilateral trading system.
Okay.
And that's the trading system in the World Trade Organization. It's essentially a global membership. It is the rules that essentially govern international trade, and there's a lot of kind of history around it, but essentially the US has largely not pulled out of it in a formal way, but has stopped the dispute settlement system from functioning and is not really seriously engaged in the negotiation of new trade agreements in that system. And so we don't have it's not functioning well, and we don't really have a meaningful replacement. And one of the concerns with the WTO in part is it's a casualty of the US-China tensions, because China is in the WTO as well. Russia is in the WTO, countries that increasingly it is very difficult to reach consensus with. So there's a question, I think, around what do we do about the international trading system, and can we revive it in a way that's meaningful, or do we need to build something new? And I think energy and focus on that would be critical for us.
Okay. Good answer. So the one policy you would say is re-engage with the World Trade Organization process and shore that up, basically. Yeah. Scott?
So that's a good one. I like that one. I think another thing we really need to reassess is the unilateral elimination of trade barriers on manufacturing inputs. About half of everything we import into the United States is stuff used by American manufacturers to make other stuff. And we have not only high tariffs on those inputs, thus raising our American manufacturers' costs, but we have all sorts of other anti-dumping duties and all, that, again, hit American manufacturers' bottom line costs. So to eliminate those taxes on industrial inputs would boost American manufacturing and the defense industrial base.
Great. So lower taxes on intermediate goods.
Yeah.
Excellent. Arthur, what's your one policy to make America more secure?
I'm going to defend tariffs for a minute.
Oh.
If you use tariffs as a way to impose costs on a foreign trading partner or to protect your own domestic industry, it's a very bad idea. But if you use tariffs as a negotiating tactic, as a way to force foreign trading nations to lower tariffs and import duties imposed on your goods produced in your country by your industries, then I think it's a good idea. I can say this because
So your policy would be to increase tariffs?
My input is use them as a negotiating tactic.
I have a feeling we could be going for a lot longer if we were allowed to. Unfortunately, we're out of time. The purpose of Sphere is to debate and consider deeply contentious policy issues in a respectful forum. Thank you, Josh, Scott, and Arthur, for doing that here with us today. Thank you so much for watching. For more information, please visit www.projectsphere.org.